Okay, I'm delighted you're all here. And this week, we are starting the book of Deuteronomy, which in essence is Moses's farewell speech to the Israelites. And this week's Parsha is Devarim, in which Moses begins the retelling of the story of the wandering through the desert after leaving Egypt. So why is he doing this? And that was the first question that occurred to me. And I don't know about you, but I was taught that when reading Torah portions or any old text, just keep asking questions. Don't try to answer them. Just keep asking questions, and then stuff will emerge. So I believe that there are really a couple of things that are going on here, and I think they're really important. The first is that Moses knows that he's going to die soon. He's been told that, and he's been told that he's not going to enter the promised land, and that he needs to prepare himself for his death, and he needs to prepare the people. So I know that many people, as they age, begin preparing for their own deaths. And as they're doing so, they are spending a lot of time reminiscing and remembering past events. And this life review is really important. It's a very important aspect of what we do when we have the luxury of aging and the ability to emotionally prepare for our own death. So part of the purpose of Moses's speech, I think, is this life review. And it's important to remember that the life review for Moses and for all of us when we engage in this kind of activity is looking back at past events from a very personal perspective. So it's not necessarily the facts, but it's the impact of those facts. And we're going to talk more about that a little bit later. The other big purpose, I think, for this recounting is that he's addressing people who were not slaves in Egypt. They're the children. You may recall that we've been taught that the generation that were slaves in Egypt have died off. So part of the impetus of this retelling is to impart the personal history so that the children who are now going to have this opportunity to move into the land that had been promised to their ancestors really have that sense of what it was like to leave Egypt and to wander in the desert. And this is exactly what we do at the Seder, right? We have that line in the Seder that talks about, remember, you were a slave in Egypt and God took you out of the land. So it's a way to really impart this very personal and dramatic and traumatic history. So let's bracket all of that for a moment. And I want to share something with you that really had an impact on me this past week. On Friday, I was tuning into the IJS meditation, and Marita Anderson, who is a chaplain in Atlanta, Georgia, led the meditation on Friday. And part of her teaching, she shared an article that she had read in the Wall Street Journal. And the title of this article is "The Boy Who Learned to See and What He Can Teach Us About Vision." So she was kind of intrigued by that title. And she shared the story, and I am sharing it from her sharing because I tried to read it and was kept out by the paywall of the Wall Street Journal. So she explained that this boy was born blind, and in his childhood, developed really terrific abilities using his other senses. And he also developed a fabulous imagination. At age 15, he had several surgeries and was able to gain the gift of sight. And the interview that the article is based on happened 5 years after his surgery, so he was 20. And during that interview, he said that the 5 years were filled with enormous suffering. And that's not what we would expect, you know? Everybody was in his life was excited that he was going to have this surgery and he's going to be able to see, and isn't that going to be fabulous? And it wasn't fabulous for him. He couldn't recognize faces. He couldn't recognize objects. Everything was really confusing for him. And we realized that the reason for that was that his brain had not developed the synapses or the connections that were necessary so that he could process what he was seeing with his eyes. And it took him 5 years to get reasonably comfortable seeing. And it took an enormous amount of practice and effort. So this story really stayed with me, and she was using it in a different way, but it really impacted me in terms of perspective. You know, we have this notion of seeing as kind of multidimensional. So it includes the perception, the literal perception, what we're seeing with our eyes. And oftentimes we see what we expect to see. And there are all kinds of studies about that. And if you like later, we can talk about it. But there's also the seeing with our heart and seeing with our soul. And we sometimes call that insight. So when Moses is recounting what he lived through, it's from his perception. It's what he saw with his eyes and what he saw with his heart and mind and soul. And what he thought was important for the children to remember and to know. So throughout the book of Deuteronomy, there are discrepancies with what we read earlier in the Torah. And, you know, one of those discrepancies comes up in this parsha where Moses blames the incident with the spies as the reason why he's not able to enter the land. Whereas earlier we learned that Moses is not able to enter the land because of the incident with the rock, in his own, you know, kind of anger and rage. So we see what we see, oftentimes what we're expecting to see. And I wonder if memory is also kind of flawed in that same way, that we remember what we feel as opposed to remembering what actually happened. So to me, all of this is part of the role that perspective plays. And I just was really kind of intrigued by it. And the other piece about this that's so compelling to me is that in many ways, Moses was the first biblical commentator, because he's commenting on what we've read in the previous 4 books. So for me, that gives me permission, and it gives you permission to also look at the Torah through our own eyes. And we can all be commentators, because after all, we have this example that we're supposed to take it in and look at it and make sense of it for ourselves in this day, in this way, which is exactly what Moses was doing when he was writing the book of Deuteronomy and giving these speeches. So, so that's what I want to leave us with today. So we will now move into silence, and we'll have about close to 15 minutes today to sit in silence. So I invite you to take your seat, and with the top of your head reaching up to the heavens and your bottom really rooted, your whole spine just elongating, gaining an inch of height as you sit in your regal position. And I invite you to allow your eyelids to gently close over your eyes. And use that gift of sight to look internally and see what you see. But insight arises. So as you are coming back to the room, slowly and gently, and with a smile on your face, I'm going to read a poem entitled The Truth of Love by Rachel Kahn. Love is a force stronger than you've ever given it credit for. It is not the passive submission you fear it to be. Love is where the rubber hits the road. Your suffering does not make you a stranger. It makes you human. Discomfort is guidance from your soul compass toward what really matters. The out-of-tune piano prays to be played in new ways, refuses to be discarded, wants its good parts to be made useful, longs for new melodies created from the invention bred of necessity. Awakened, we can no longer afford the luxury of unconsciousness. Its price now outside our purview. Praise be to these united states of broken hearts, these shattered instruments of transmission, forcing us to see with new eyes, to feel with raw nerved belief, to fly with no net, to go collectively off script, to dismantle the illusion and know the truth of love.